my name is Christina. I am Whilst Iris Snaps on Instagram and Whilst Iris Snaps Designs, and this is a video about cross stitch. This is video number 20, and today's video is just going to be about my two new releases, Helen Monro and Helen's Drum, and hopefully you enjoyed the sneak preview in the intro there. I have procrastinated for far too long with this sampler and I have no idea why. Perhaps it's that I wasn't up for sharing it, wanted to keep it to myself. Who knows? But it's here now. I've already added the chart to my website, so there's no going back, and it's the perfect day to film a video. It's gorgeous and sunny here in North Yorkshire, so I have no excuse. And I've got a cup of tea in another of my 80s films mugs, and well done to those of you who guessed that As You Wish is of course from The Princess Bride. We can definitely be friends if you got that right. But yeah, again, this is another of my obsessions, 80s films, and I've got quite a few of these mugs. I'll share them going forward in future videos, I'm sure. Great soundtrack on this one. So let's get cracking, shall we? So I'm going to start by pointing out something that's probably fairly obvious. I am English. Both of my parents are English. All four of my grandparents were English. However, you just need to go back one more generation and one of my 8 great-grandparents was Scottish. My great-grandmother, Jessie Goodwin Waddell, was born in Falkirk in 1878. And perhaps this goes some tiny way to explaining why I am incredibly passionate about Scottish samplers. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my English samplers, but there is just something so special about a Scottish sampler. I don't know if it's the colours, the composition, the initials, I just love them. And I am going to add a photograph of my great-grandmother Jessie here because she will feature again a little later in my video, or will become clear. And it's probably quite obvious from the photograph, but my great-grandmother was incredibly tiny. I mean, I'm not tall, I'm 5'3.5", 5'4" on a good day with the wind behind me, but I'm going to say Jessie was around 4'7", 4'8" perhaps, but by all accounts she was a formidable woman and incredibly strong. She had 9 babies, all of whom survived infancy. Unfortunately, they did lose their eldest boy, John Robert, during World War I. But my mum has just such lovely memories of her. She says that she was constantly baking on the range in their tiny terraced house, and that she wouldn't allow any of her grandchildren, and there must have been hundreds of them, to call her Nana or Grandma. It had to be Mother. And that everybody called her Mother, never Jessie. So I don't know whether this was a Scottish thing. But anyway, I will insert a photograph here. It is a photograph of my great auntie's wedding, Jessie's daughter, also called Jessie. Now to another wonderful girl from Falkirk, Miss Helen Monro. So what can I tell you about Helen Monro's sampler? Well, I first saw Helen's sampler around 3 years ago and fell in love with it instantly. I just had that feeling, and by that feeling I mean I knew it was coming home to me. I just knew it was going to be part of my collection. I showed it to my husband Tom. He said, absolutely, I agree, go for it. So yeah, and in fact there were 2 samplers that were being auctioned that were stitched by Helen Monro. The large decorative one that I'd fallen in love with, and there was a simpler, perhaps that had been stitched a little earlier, sampler by Helen. And I would have loved to have them both. However, on the day of the auction, I did manage to secure the sampler that I'd fallen in love with, but we were at my parents' house and the internet went down and I didn't manage to get the smaller sampler. So as you can imagine, I was quite disappointed, but some you win, some you lose. You can't have them all. It was a sign, perhaps. Anyway, fast forward a year and I was chatting to Rachel from Needle and Flax Linens, and I was telling her about a beautiful Scottish sampler that I was about to chart, but I needed to find the perfect fabric for it because I really wanted the colours to glow like they did on the original sampler. And she said, send me a photograph, and I did, and she said, I have the other sampler. I have Helen Monro's other sampler. Well, what were the odds? So even though I didn't manage to add that smaller sampler to my collection, I am absolutely thrilled that Rachel owns it. And Rachel has given me permission to share the fact that she owns the other sampler and to share photographs of that sampler. So thank you, Rachel. Anyway, without further ado, let me show you my reproduction of Helen's sampler. And there you go. Isn't she a beauty? Can you see why I fell in love instantly with it? And I know a lot of you have commented upon this band of flowers, and it is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it was the house that sold me. I love it. And I will add in a collage of photographs and close-ups of the reproduction here. So what can I tell you about Helen Monro? Well, you already know that she was born in Falkirk, Stirlingshire on December the 13th, 1819. Her parents were William Monro, a saddler, and as you can see, he's stitched in black. Sadly, he'd already passed away by the time Helen stitched this sampler. And then her mum, Janet Gentles. And on this sampler, she stitched mum with her married name, possibly out of respect for her dad. On the smaller sampler that Rachel owns, Helen stitched her mum with her maiden name, J.G. And then we have Helen here. Janet doesn't ever remarry, so Helen remains an only child. And then here we have William's parents, Alexander Monro and Margaret Clark, both stitched in black. And then Janet's parents, Thomas Gentle and Helen Brown. And on the smaller sampler, Helen has stitched all of Janet's siblings, all 11 of them perfectly in age order. But what I believe she's done here is stitched Janet's eldest sibling, John Gentles, his wife, Mary Rankin, and then some of their children, possibly because Helen was living with them at the time. I believe the sampler was stitched around 1827, 1828, and John and Mary's youngest child, Margaret Gentles, was born in 1827. Perhaps a later edition, so that's why she's been stitched above, and the baby of the family, so stitched in pink. Helen and her mother Janet seem to kind of flip between different relatives' homes during Helen's childhood, all on the same street in Falkirk, West Bridge Street. And then when Janet dies, Helen goes to live with her grandmother, Helen Brown, her uncle James Gentles, and her cousin Thomas. Now, she and Thomas must have done incredibly well at school because by the 1851 census, both she and Thomas are noted as accountants at the Commercial Bank in Scotland. And then, 6 years later, in 1857, cousin Thomas becomes husband Thomas. I believe marrying first cousins was common practice back then. In any case, it was a tumultuous start to married life for the couple. Just a few weeks after they were married, Thomas went on trial for breach of trust and embezzlement at the bank. Now, I have read lots of articles and accounts of what happened, and I do realise it's quite a sensitive subject, but I wanted to tell the story of what happened. So, the bank manager at the time, Henry Salmon, was stealing large sums of money from customers' accounts. And when suspicions arose and the investigators were called in, obviously Henry Salmon's crimes were uncovered. And on learning this, Henry absconded and committed suicide, and thus leaving Thomas and another colleague, another senior clerk, to, I guess, face the flag. The judge, in his summary at the trial, acknowledged that Thomas and his colleague hadn't been responsible for the crimes, nor had they benefited from them, but that they had both been aware of them in some capacity and hadn't blown the whistle. So he sentenced them both to 18 months in jail. However, just 2 months later, a royal pardon was issued by Queen Victoria herself, and the two men were released. And Thomas went straight back to a job in banking at the Falkirk Savings Bank and was elected town registrar, registering the births, deaths and marriages of the people in Falkirk until his death in 1910, aged 87. So make of that what you will. Anyway, it wasn't until the bulk of all of my research on Helen had been done. We had visited Helen's hometown of Falkirk last summer, and I was laid in bed one morning, probably about 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's when I do my best thinking. And I thought, hang on a minute. If Thomas was registering births, deaths and marriages in Falkirk until 1910, and my great-grandmother Jessie was born in Falkirk at the end of 1877. So I ordered Jessie's birth certificate, and would you believe, here we have, in Thomas's beautiful handwriting, my great-grandmother's birth certificate, and he signed his name, Thomas Gentles, here. And honestly, I was shaking when I opened the envelope. I was so thrilled to learn that he registered Jessie's birth, but that also, I had so many questions. My great-great-grandmother, Christina, my namesake, she was present for the registering of the birth. Did she already know Thomas? Did she know Helen? Did Helen help Thomas with his role of registering the births, deaths and marriages in Falkirk? They lived just streets apart in Falkirk, so perhaps they knew each other through that. But also, in another coincidence, my great-grandmother Jessie was born on the same day as Helen Monro, December the 13th. So Thomas has to have commented on that. Anyway, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent. Back to Helen. So she and Thomas don't have any children of their own, but they appear to have been part of a really close-knit wider family, and they have various nieces and nephews living with them throughout their married life. And both she and Thomas remained pillars of the community in Falkirk. And I think the inscription on her gravestone gives us a really good insight into her character. It reads, "Her faith was firm, her participation in Christian good works zealous and heartfelt, her disposition gentle, benevolent and hospitable, and her end was peace. And I know I'm biased, but I think our Helen sounds like one wonderful lady. Now to some information about my reproduction. So the stitch count is 232 by 287, and I stitched it on 36 count Dolly Madison from Needle and Flax Linens, of course. I used Overo Soie Soie d'Alger silks, and there are just 14 colours in total. And I do, as always, provide a DMC conversion. And in fact, it was the DMC conversion that I used to stitch Helen's drum that I'll be showing later on in my video. There are no over one stitches, so it's suitable to be stitched on linen or Aida. And there are just a few speciality stitches that I'll highlight now. There are eyelets in these flowers here, and then the petals are four-sided stitches. There is backstitch in the flower stems and then in the curlicues around Helen's name. And then, as you can see, there are two backstitched lines that run parallel with the border. There are quite a few quirks, shall we say, to Helen's sampler, and I've highlighted several of these. The more obvious ones are the ones that could catch you out, should I say, on the chart layout page. And for those who perhaps adore Helen Monro's sampler as much as I do, but weren't keen to stitch the whole thing, I have designed Helen's drum. And there we have that beautiful white house again. I'll give you a little bit of a twirl. That gorgeous basket of flowers. And the pin set is from Jersey Girl Stitch Co, Teresa and Anna, and it was designed specifically for Helen's drum, and they've named the pin set Flowers for Helen. You'll be able to find that on their website, and I'll put the link in the drop down box below. And the velveteen is from Lady Dot Creates. I think the colour is heirloom. I'll need to double check that though, my brain is a little frazzled at this point. The drum, the stitch count is 226 by 60, and the linen is 40 count Patriots Brew from R&R Reproductions. And as I mentioned earlier, I used the DMC conversion from Helen Monro's sampler, and it uses just 11 of the 14 colours used in Helen's sampler. And I also have a tutorial detailing how I finish my drums on my website, and again I will link that in the drop down box below. And you can download the PDF chart from my website or get a hard copy of the chart from the shops that already stock my charts. And that's it. That's the end of my video. I hope I have managed to convey just how special Helen Monro and her sampler is to me and my family. And I'm going to leave you with a few photographs from our trip up to Scotland last summer. We were such tourists. It was a complete whistle-stop tour of Glasgow, Edinburgh, Falkirk, and then we stayed in Stirling, and we packed in so much. We saw Calendar House in Falkirk. We saw the Falkirk Wheel, but sadly not in motion, but that's a story for another day. We drove past the Kelpies, we went to the William Wallace Monument in Stirling, and of course when I was in Falkirk I had to go and see the street where Helen lived with her family, West Bridge Street, and then the bank where she and Thomas worked. And I was incredibly honoured that I got to visit Helen's final resting place, and I laid just a small bouquet of irises and thanked her for stitching such a beautiful sampler, and that I would be taking care of the sampler going forward. So yes, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye.